Hi, everyone, and welcome to Module 2. This is the second module in ECI 579, and during this module, we are going to focus on ways to build effective partnerships through collaboration. So this week, the goals for our mini lecture are to have a quick review of your reflections from Module 1. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted those. We're going to talk about ways to partner through collaboration with both professionals and parents in co-taught and or special education classrooms. And then we'll have a wrap up with a few important reminders for next week. Before we go into that, just a couple quick housekeeping things that I failed to mention last week. This class is set up to be a Monday through Sunday sort of online course, and I don't think I actually mentioned that in the first module, in the first audio lecture, but just so that everyone's clear, all of your materials will be available online every Monday morning, and then assignments will almost always be due on Sunday evenings. The only exception to that, I believe, is your final assignment, which is due on a Wednesday because of the final exam calendar and the dates for final grades. So I know we started on a Wednesday and your first reflection was due on a Sunday, and so now we're on track so that everything will be posted on Mondays and all assignments are due on Sundays. One other quick thing, we will get into this a little bit more and I think maybe next module or the module after that, but I want to go ahead and mention the importance here of person first language. I actually haven't run into any issues so far, so you guys are doing a great job with that, but I wanted to mention it. In the field of special education, when you're talking and discussing the needs of individuals with disabilities, we like to use person first language. So for example, instead of saying Johnny is autistic, you would say Johnny has autism or Johnny is a boy with autism. So just keep that in mind as you're writing reflections or, as you're reading, you'll notice, and they probably, if they haven't already talked about that in chapter 1, it'll come up soon when we start talking more specifically about individuals with disabilities. But I just wanted to throw that out there early so that as you're thinking and talking and writing in your reflections that this isn't, you realize it's an important piece. Now, we will also talk about the different schools of thought and how some people actually prefer identity first language, which means they actually prefer that you call them autistic or disabled versus Johnny with autism. So we'll talk about where those two different schools of thought come from, and you can think about what your own views might be around that. But ultimately, in this class and in special education, in the field of special education, we use person first language. So we'll talk about some of the other fields that subscribe to the use of identity first language and where those views have sort of developed. But again, our class, we are going to be using person first language. So keep that in mind as you go throughout. And again, no one has used identity first language so far, but I just wanted to give you a heads up because I usually see it and then I remember that I failed to talk about that. And we will go into more detail in the next couple modules. So for module 1 review, you should be able to answer these questions. You should be able to tell me, what is IDEA, right? So what does that stand for? And what are the 6 principles of IDEA, okay? What are some of the historical events that led to the development of special education in the United States? So think about some of those court cases that we discussed in the previous module. Think about some of the movements, parent rights movements that really had a strong impact on the development of special education in the U.S. And then finally, you should be able to tell me what an IEP is. So what does that stand for? What does it do? What does it mean? How do we conduct IEP meetings? Who's a part of the IEP team? What do you include in an IEP? Okay, so be able to kind of describe some of those components. And if you feel like you aren't able to give me a good summary of what each of those are, then you definitely want to go back and revisit the module so that you make sure you have a good grasp, because this is the foundation of special ed. So you want to know that you have a really strong grasp on these foundational concepts. So far, I think about half of you have done reflections, so this isn't representative of the entire class, but I just wanted to give some examples of some of your previous experiences. So there are some students who mentioned, several students actually, who mentioned that they have experience with individuals who have disabilities who are part of their family. So either, close or extended relatives. A few of you talked about classmates who have had disabilities or students you've been in classes with over the years. I think one person has been a camp counselor who's worked with students with disabilities. And then a couple of you mentioned specifically that you had had experiences with individuals with ADHD, ADD, and or autism. So that's kind of a brief summary of the experiences that you've highlighted. And one of the expectations that one student shared that I really, really liked was that you are expecting more of yourself as a teacher. So I asked, what are your expectations going into the classroom? And this person said that their goal is to really expect more of themselves. And I think of their self. And I think that's a really important piece because a lot of times we think about what we expect from our students, right? And then it's a really awesome and introspective way to just pause and think about what is it that I can do to support the needs of all of my learners, and how much more can I expect from myself to contribute to their positive, safe, and effective learning environment. And that, I think, is an excellent expectation. Some fears and questions that came up were around balancing the needs of learners with and without disabilities, and then also the best approaches for supporting learners with disabilities. So really the goal of this course is to help reduce some of those fears. And I truly do hope and believe that over the course of the semester that you will be less fearful and have fewer reservations about how you will find this balance, because that's a lot of what we're trying to do is talk about inclusion and how you might be able to engage in co-teaching, how you can engage in small group learning, how you can engage in peer learning that will help you find that balance between supporting learners with and without disabilities. And then we will also talk about specific approaches for specific learning needs. And so I think that at the end of this course, you will have a fair grasp, if you will, on what it takes to do that. I don't expect that at the end of this one course on special education that you will walk out of here and be prepared to teach a classroom, full of learners with disabilities, or even a classroom where you feel completely competent in supporting the needs of a few learners with disabilities, but that you at least know where to go, or that you at least have some resources and that you have a jump start to get going in terms of supporting their needs. So to get us started, let's do a quick pause and practice. Read this scenario and then think about how Ms. Vargas might approach this conversation, okay? When you finish, move along to the next slide. So some of the characteristics of collaboration. You want to acknowledge that collaboration is voluntary, that it's based on equality, that it requires shared goals and shared resources, and it's emergent. So, collaboration requires more than one person, but you don't necessarily have to collaborate, right? And so you really want to develop collaborative relationships that are based on equality, where you're working together to achieve a common goal. That is when they are most effective. So, reflecting on your personal belief system. This is one of the prerequisites for collaboration. So, before you can collaborate effectively, you need to think about your own belief system, and you need to have shared effort that will lead to better outcomes. Okay? You also need to be able to tolerate other people's beliefs, because if you don't have an understanding of your own beliefs and respect for other people's differences in beliefs, it will become very difficult to collaborate and work together. You also want to be able to respectfully disagree, okay? So a second prerequisite for collaboration is refining your interaction skills. You might find that you communicate in a different way. And so the two of you, let's pretend we're talking about co-teachers, might need to find a common ground for how you will communicate your needs or your students' needs, okay? And then you want to develop steps to productive interaction. So how can you engage in effective meetings? How can you respond to resistance? How can you resolve conflicts in a productive way? And finally, you want to be able to contribute to a supportive environment. So you want to have administrative support and shared planning time so that you can create an environment that leads to student development to growth to positive learning spaces for all of your learners. Okay, so these are some of the prerequisites for collaboration. Before you can even collaborate, what do I need to do? And then we have a number of things that really foster a sense of inclusion. So, collaborative services that foster inclusion. One of those is shared problem solving. So, that you can kind of see this cycle here. And if you notice, it actually has IDEA inside of that, but it's actually ideal. So, you are discovering a shared need, and then you identify this problem. You propose solutions, you evaluate the ideas, you plan the specifics, you implement the solution, and you evaluate the outcomes. And so when you work in a collaborative way, when you work together on a team, you're able to better address each of these. So let's say, for example, you have a student who is in your mainstream classroom, but you notice that he is not able to sit in his seat longer than about 5 minutes. You notice that he often puts his head down on his desk. You notice that his work is generally only about half complete. You're noticing some, some signs in terms of his performance that are concerning for you, right? And so when you discover something like this, you want to be able to identify the problem, and then you want to work with your co-teacher or your partner, team teacher, to propose solutions and evaluate ideas, right? So proposing solutions might take us back to in Module 1 where we talked about response to intervention. Is this student receiving enough support? Is he receiving the support that he needs at Tier 1, or does he need Tier 2 intervention to better support his needs? Okay, so identifying the problem and proposing solutions, and then implementing a plan, right? So let's move him to Tier 2 supports, and then we're going to collect data, see how he's performing, and evaluate the outcomes of that. So you want to engage in shared problem solving. And if that solution has been effective, if Tier 2 supports helped him to strengthen his learning strategies, it should be continued or discontinued or gradually phased out. So a lot of times students will move up a phase or move up a tier, and they'll stay there for a while. And when they become proficient, we're able to move them, include them, or integrate them back into their primary setting or the general setting. If the solution has been positive but it's not ideal, then you can modify it. So, you move him to Tier 2, but he's not quite receiving the supports he needs. So you think about some of the instructional strategies that you're using at that tier, or the type of materials that you're using. So you modify it a bit so that you're addressing the needs. And then if the solution was not effective, then you consider other possibilities. So if Tier 2 supports in RTI provided no supports at all, then maybe you think about moving to Tier 3. So this is how you want to evaluate outcomes in a collaborative environment. One of the most common ways that we collaborate in ways that foster inclusion in schools is through co-teaching. And this is probably one of the ways that many of you will have opportunities to support more learners with disabilities. And co-teaching occurs when there are two or more teachers. Generally, it's one special education teacher and one general education teacher, and they share the instruction for a single group of students in a single classroom. So you have one classroom of students, and you might have 18 students who do not have IEPs or have not been identified as having disabilities, and then you might have 8 students who do have special needs. So there are two professionals who have two different points of views, but you are combining your strengths to support all of the students in your classrooms. And co-taught settings are not always the answer. It's really critical to identify the extent to which the student needs are responsive to that of a co-taught classroom. And sometimes the number of students in your classroom has to justify the need for 2 teachers. I think some schools are getting away from that and are being more responsive to the idea that the pedagogy that teachers bring from special ed and general education are critical for the needs of students with and without disabilities. So I think we're starting to see some of our smaller classrooms, even if it isn't a really large classroom in terms of the number of students, that they're still having co-taught classrooms in the building. So now we're going to revisit Miss Verglis's approach and think about how you might respond to this conversation. And when you finish, so think about what you would do differently than in your first response, and then we'll keep moving. So now we're going to talk about some co-teaching models. And first, let's just talk about what co-teaching is. So again, it occurs when there are two or more educators, a gen ed teacher, a special ed teacher, and or another specialist. So this other specialist could actually be a behavior specialist. It might even be a speech language pathologist. So when these people share the instruction for a single group of students. So we have a few different models in terms of the actual setup of the classroom, the organization of the classroom, and in terms of who teaches and who's supporting. And you have to think about ways to find balance in these co-teaching approaches. So in the one teach, one observe, you have one person who is teaching and then one person who is collecting data. And this is not used quite as frequently. It's often for a specific person, for a specific purpose. For example, if you have a new student who moved into your classroom and he or she is having significant behavioral problems, then you might have one teacher, let's say the gen ed teacher is leading the course, she's teaching or he's teaching, and then the co-teacher, the special ed teacher, is collecting data on that child's behavior. So it's often used for a specific sort of intervention or data collection method. It's not our primary way of co-teaching. The second approach to co-teaching is what we call station teaching, and this you see much more often. It's probably what you see in many classrooms with the parapro. It's pretty similar to that, or the teaching assistant. And so in station teaching, you have smaller student to teacher ratios, and the students are organized by their learning style and or their math and reading level. And so this is a really great way to break students up into groups that are appropriate for their needs. So for example, when many of you said, I'm really concerned about how I will support learners who have more or less needs than others, this is one way you can do that. Because in a co-taught classroom, if your special education teacher has, specialist background in supporting students with disabilities who have significant reading needs, then those students can be in the group with the special ed teacher, and you can support learners in different groups. You can also rotate your students so that you are both seeing them and you're not just each only working with one particular group. So station teaching is a really effective approach to co-teaching that addresses the needs of all of your students. Another example of co-teaching is parallel teaching. You'll see this probably a little less often, but the cool thing about parallel teaching is that it allows each teacher to teach to their strengths. So you're essentially breaking the class or splitting that class in half, and then you teach to your strengths. So if you are working on if you're working on a unit on the solar system, I think I always end up using that as an example, and one of you has particular strengths in literacy and one has strong particular strengths in science, then first your science specialist, teacher, the gen ed teacher whose background is in science might introduce the lesson, provide the content, and then your students move from that half of the classroom to the co-instructor who will support their writing and their reflection. So maybe they're doing a brief report on a description of the solar system, etc. So that way each teacher has an opportunity to teach to their strengths, and then you also are able to teach to the students' preferences. And this allows you to cover a lot of material. So you're able to, tackle two different types of activities, if you will, within the lesson. Another approach is alternative teaching, and this can be very useful when there's a small group of students who has different needs, and so you still want to vary this group though. So what you don't want to happen is to have a classroom of 24 students, and you have 4 students who have significant needs. What you don't want to happen is always have the small group be those same 4 students, right? You want to actually alternate that so that students don't feel isolated and singled out. And what happens when you have the same group of 4 students who have needs is that's no longer inclusion. You're essentially creating a self-contained environment within a mainstream classroom, and that's not what we want to happen. For inclusion, we want our students to be well integrated, to be collaborating with their peers who do not have disabilities, and you want them to be able to you don't want typically developing peers to identify that, hey, this same 4 group of students always goes to the back, right? So you want to eliminate, those are some of the concerns that we see in quote unquote inclusive settings where students are not truly included. So alternative teaching, it can include pre-teaching, it can be used for reteaching if you're revisiting something, or it can be used for enrichment for those students who need it. We also have a teaming approach where the co-teachers are equal and they're shared in terms of their leadership, and they literally are up there beside each other co-teaching a lesson. I think this is a really great model of co-teaching. I think it's like what you would want to see in the classroom when you step in, but at the same time, it's also quite difficult to truly meet the needs of all of your learners when you're both teaching in the same way with that shared sort of equal delivery of the material. But it's really nice to see in large groups when when all of your students are there together. So you could model strategies. One teacher might model strategies that are conducive for some learners, and then the other teacher could model strategies that she knows will help those students who are struggling. And that way, none of the students necessarily know which strategies are being modeled for whom, but they know that they have 2 different options. That's how we differentiate our instruction, okay? So teaming is a great way to do it. I would say that it takes much more practice and experience in co-teaching, and that it's something that wouldn't be quite as easy when you're first starting out. We also have one teach, one assist. So this is only used when one teacher feels especially comfortable with the curriculum, and it usually requires specific like one-on-one support for students. And we don't use this one quite as often because that means one teacher is providing a lot of the content delivery, and then one teacher is really providing one-on-one support for one student at a time. And so in this case, we're often missing some of the needs of additional students because we're doing this one-on-one support. All right, so now is a good time to take a quick break, and you can revisit any of the material we've covered so far. And then when you come back, we will jump into other types of partnerships. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the ways to engage in co-teaching in the classroom, I want you to take a few minutes to think about the student makeup and support needs that you've observed in either your previous placements or any observations that you've seen or any experiences that you've had in the classroom. I know some of you have different backgrounds, so you may or may not have spent a ton of time in the classrooms. So whatever your experiences have been in the classrooms, use that as your reflection for this activity. And then I want you to revisit the co-teaching approaches we just discussed, and then choose the approach you believe would be most appropriate to meet the needs of those students during a particular lesson. Okay, so think about who might be the general educator, who would be the special educator, what roles would each of you play in that classroom, and how will those roles meet the needs of all of your learners. So think about maybe a friend that you have who is also in this class, or just someone you know. You can make up who would be the other person, but you really want to focus on what the characteristics of that other co-teacher would be. And think about how you would engage in supporting the needs of learners in those classrooms. So a few pragmatics related to co-teaching. Students with and without disabilities are integrated, right? So we're not just talking about having them be in the same physical space, but they're actually integrated. Both teachers have teaching and supportive roles. So although sometimes co-taught classrooms can mirror what we often see but in the dynamics between teachers and teaching assistants. In co-taught classrooms, both teachers have very important teaching and supportive roles, and so it's important to acknowledge that. We also have best approaches or evidence-based practices that depend on the student needs, that depend on the subject, that depend on experience, and depend on the setting. So we have to take those into consideration. And finally, the curriculum dictates the approach in many ways and in many cases. So depending on the curriculum, there are some special education curricula that actually require one-to-one delivery of the content, and so sometimes that type of environment requires a particular approach to supporting the learners. In terms of working on a team, it's important to acknowledge that the team has different participant roles, and so you have to engage in professional and personal and team roles all at once. So it can be a little bit it can be a lot to balance, right? You want to think about the goals of a team. So both tasks and maintenance goals should be explicit. You want to be really clear about the goals of your team. Okay, if we're working together in this classroom, what are our goals for our learners? What do we want to achieve for our learners? And that's a big piece of it, is that you acknowledge that as team teachers, as co-teachers, all of these students belong to both of you, right? It's not, oh, Miss Pearson has the special ed students and Mr. Jackson has the students who are typically developing or are in general education, right? No, these are our students and we're both responsible for all of them. So what are our goals for them, okay? And you want to be really explicit about those team goals. So let's take a look at this video. I think it's about 5 or 6 minutes. Click here to watch, and she really does a great job of explaining how you can collaborate effectively while teaching. When you're finished, we'll keep going. So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about a different type of partnership and collaboration. Okay, so consultation is another way that we collaborate in schools, and this is a specialized problem-solving process that involves assistance, and typically one professional with particular expertise assists another professional who needs that. So one of the examples that I usually give is that we have behavioral therapists who come into the schools, and they have very specific training in managing behavior. They're called BCBAs, or Board Certified Behavior Analysts. And they often are assigned to a number of schools, and they'll come into the classroom and help with data collection. They'll analyze student behaviors. They will provide strategies for the teachers to help manage student behaviors in the classrooms. And they are providing that additional expertise that teachers may not have. And so BCBAs are a really good example of a consultant who could support you and your students' needs in the classrooms, that it goes beyond what you might be able to do by yourself. Now, there's a level of complexity to collaboration that we have to acknowledge, and one of those things is that disagreements often occur, right? And we have to be able to review or view the situation from the other person's point of view or from their frame of reference. And so, especially if you're new to co-teaching with a special educator, you're going to come from two different schools of thought in many cases. You're probably coming from two different training backgrounds. And so you have to work together to be reflective and be reciprocal in the way you view people's experiences and background. And you want to acknowledge your own sort of perceptions and your own attitude that you're bringing to the table. And you want to reevaluate your solution. So how can you meet each other in the middle? How can we find common ground? How can we achieve this goal that we want to achieve for our students, okay? And then disagreements can actually create better options for students. So although they can be hard to work through sometimes, in many cases, the end result is that you've actually created an even better lesson plan, or you've arranged the classroom in a better way to serve the needs of your students. All right, so we're going to revisit Ms. Verglis's classroom once more. And now that we have talked about approaches to effective collaboration, think about how Ms. Verglis might approach this conversation. Okay, so jot that down. And these activities are really for your own engagement. So I encourage you to do them. Obviously, you're in an online environment. I'm not, not requiring them. I don't require that you submit them, but I do highly encourage you to actually think through these because I think they're very helpful. Okay. Now, partnering with parents. This is, kind of one of what I like to call my baby, because this is what a lot of the work that I do focuses on. And I think it's one of the most critical ways that we are able to support the needs of students in the classroom. Obviously, working together with your co-teacher is critical. Obviously, partnering with your administrators is critical. Obviously, working strongly and closely with related service providers is critical. But parents know your students or their children better than anyone else. And so if you are not partnering with parents to support the needs of the students in your classrooms, then you are absolutely doing them an injustice. So, the roles of families. Families have the ultimate responsibility for children, and they have the responsibility for assuring that their children receive and benefit from education. So you have the responsibility of teaching them particular content, of preparing them for the next grade level, of making sure that they reach particular milestones, right? But ultimately, parents have that responsibility for assuring that their children receive and benefit from their education. And so our perceptions of benefit might be very different than parents, okay? And federal law acknowledges that families have a significant role and responsibility in being partners with educators. And this is actually one of those 6 principles of IDEA. So at the beginning of this lecture where I said, what are the 6 principles of IDEA? Hopefully you said parents are partners, because that is actually a federally mandated component of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So over the years, parents have fought and won the right to education for children with disabilities and the right for parents to have a say in the education of children with disabilities. And so this is a quote from, I believe it was from an interview with a teacher, and it said, "Our job as educators is not just instructing students, but strengthening the role and responsibilities of parents in ensuring that families have meaningful opportunities to participate in the education of their children at home and at school." So you're probably like, all right, Dr. P, what do we do? Like, you're saying this is important, but how can we engage parents who are not present? How can we engage parents who work all of the time? How can we engage parents who don't answer the phone? How can we engage parents who never respond to my emails? How can we engage parents who never even take materials out of their kids' backpacks? How can we engage parents that we've never even met? I understand. I acknowledge that those are many of the same challenges that many teachers are facing. I think when it comes to engaging and collaborating with parents, you first have to understand the perspective of the families. If you don't know that mom works 2 jobs, if you don't know that your student actually has siblings who have special needs, if you don't know that the family just moved to a new house, if you don't know that one of the parents is sick, then you have a different perception of what their contributions are, or their lack of contributions are, or their willingness to partner is, right? And so you need to create a better understanding of family members, and you want to be aware of parents' reactions to child's disabilities and factors that affect that. So for some parents who are new to their child being identified with the disability, they might be experiencing some emotions of grief. They might be ambivalent, or they might be more optimistic now that they know that they have an official diagnosis, okay? Parents also struggle based on the intensity or the complexity of a disability. So if you think about, a single parent who has three other children and they have a student with a pretty significant disability, it can have an impact on their ability to cope. Thinking about the time of diagnosis and how the information is shared, thinking about their culture and their background and how that plays a role in their willingness to either accept the disability or even the extent to which they find it appropriate to partner with the teachers. So there are some cultures where, teachers are the expert, where they are, they're more knowledgeable, and so parents think it is actually rude or disrespectful to kind of question what the teacher is doing in the classroom. And so you have to kind of, if you don't understand that that's where they come from, you might assume that that parent or those parents or that family is just not engaged. And in many cases, that may not be true. You also want to think about their resources. Maybe they can't make it to parent-teacher conferences on a Thursday evening at 5:30 because they have to work, and maybe they work a job where they don't have paid time off, or maybe they have to take a bus from across town, and by the time they get there, it's 7:30, right? So you have to think about all the factors that contribute to working effectively with parents. And then, yes, it's more work on you, but you have to consider ways to help them overcome that. So we like to think about the use of family centered practices, and we'll talk more about a few of those in a second. So you want to engage in home and school communication, so using communication logs. You want to talk to parents about how they can best communicate. Now, you don't want to be messaging parents on Facebook, but we have gotten much more flexible in our ability to text parents. Maybe some of them prefer texting over calling. Many of them probably prefer texting over emailing. For some of them, it is nearly impossible to make it in to these meetings when they're scheduled at certain times. So you want to think about how you can communicate and make sure that you are keeping parents in the loop, okay? Thinking about parent conferences before, during, and after. How can you partner with them? How can you make them feel comfortable? How can you engage effectively? You want to engage in parent education. Sometimes parents just don't understand what their children's needs are or how you're supporting them in the classroom. And then how can you engage them and involve them? And then thinking about the complexity of parent collaboration, you want to understand their frame of reference. So these are some examples of family-centered practices. You can look through these, and over the course of the semester, I will continue to give some tips and strategies on engaging parents and thinking about how each of our modules relates to parent engagement. And so you'll read more about this both in this chapter, in chapter 3, but also as we go throughout the semester, I'll continue to talk about ways that we will engage family culture and address family needs in this sort of collaborative context. So here's another opportunity to pause and practice and think about how Ms. Verglis could prepare for this teacher or for this parent-teacher conference or meeting that she's going to have with her students' parents, excuse me. Okay, and after you think through that, keep moving. So finally, we're going to talk about working with paraprofessionals. And so, many of you are probably going to be teaching in middle and high school, so you might not necessarily have a TA, but you could have a parapro who is supporting a student with a disability. So this is something to keep in mind, especially if you're in a general education classroom and you have students with disabilities who might have like a one-on-one aid. So you might have opportunities to work with paraprofessionals. And it's important to understand the working relationship, the dynamics between the parapro and the gen ed teacher. You want to think about how you can collaborate effectively with them, and then you want to give specific attention to the complexities of working together and using supervisory skills. So, sometimes you have these parapros in many cases who have been in the schools for years and years. So like many of you will graduate next year or in the next couple years, and your first placement will be in a school where there's a parapro who I promise you will have been there for like 30 years. And so, there's sometimes a struggle between the dynamics of like what constitutes knowledge, in that some people develop great knowledge over the years, and what constitutes knowledge in terms of your training, right? And so if you're trained to be a science teacher, and you bring that knowledge and that background with you, then sometimes parapros struggle with, well, I've been here for 30 years, so you don't get to come in and tell me how to teach this science lesson, sort of thing. So you have to really grapple with that sometimes, and you want to make sure that your teaching assistant or paraprofessional is not intimidated by you, and you want to actually understand that you can learn a lot from them, right? So they've been there for a while. Yes, they bring knowledge and experience to the classroom. They've probably worked with every type of student, every type of family, probably seen many disability categories come through over the years. And so you really want to make sure that you are working together, and that although you need to provide supervisory skills, although you are essentially the supervisor in that situation, you also want to let them know that you are open and willing to learn from them. And I think when you do that, you kind of break down those walls, those hierarchical walls, and you're able to both benefit from your relationship.